And I said, well, what do you do with somebody who lacks joy in life? And he says, good question. He says, I don't know. So I said, okay, well, I guess I'll go read about it. So I went to the research literature. I went, psych info is what psychologists tend to look at, or index.
Hmm.
And there was nothing, like almost zero
Mm.
research on joy. So I thought, well, there you go. There's my dissertation topic.
Three, two, one. Welcome to Love Machine.
Well, welcome to another Nerding Out with That Nerdy Catholic. I am Seth Payne, That Nerdy Catholic, and we're joined today with Brent Robbins, and we're just going to jump right into it. So, Brent, tell me a little bit about yourself. Where do you work, and what do you do there?
Yeah, I am a psychology professor. I'm a professor at Point Park University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I've been at Point Park University for 15 years, and I teach a variety of courses. We have a doctoral program in clinical psychology, we have a doctoral program in critical psychology, we have a master's program in community psychology, and undergraduate programs with concentrations, including a concentration in religion and spirituality. And I teach in all of those programs off and on, mostly in the doctoral programs. And I have a book, The Medicalized Body and Anesthetic Culture, that came out in 2018. And a lot of my research has been on emotion and the psychology of happiness and joy and virtue, but also some painful emotions too. And I'm also interested in studies of the mind-body relationship. And emotion is a really good thing to study if you want to understand the mind-body relationship. So those are a little bit about me. And then I was a Catholic as a child, raised as a Catholic. When I went to college, like a lot of people, I drifted away from my faith and really started to question my faith and really began to espouse an atheism. Sort of it's depending on how you define atheism, agnosticism. Some people might refer to it as agnosticism in the sense that I was still holding out hope uh, in God, but was had all but sort of given up on that.
Yeah.
And uh, and then there was a gradual change in terms of that I think was partly intellectual, in that I started to see some evidence pointing towards the importance of faith for people's lives. I think that was sort of planting some seeds.
Mm-hmm.
My wife had a conversion experience. She was a Protestant, Presbyterian, converted to Catholicism without, at the time that I was an atheist, much to my frustration, and I wasn't really thrilled about that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that was, but then she started inviting me to go to mass with her, and I sort of reluctantly started to go at first, wanting to support her, and then gradually that started to have an impact on me, and then all of that sort of culminated in something I've talked about on the journey home, for example, is this experience that I had in a
Mm-hmm.
cemetery during a retreat, where I had a really a mystical experience of the presence of God, and very clear, distinct messages from God about where I was going with my life. And that was really powerfully transformative. It was something, it was a direct, unmediated kind of experience that I couldn't deny. And then
Mm-hmm.
ever since then, I've been very passionately engaged with the faith, and
All right.
and glad to be home.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk more about that experience at that retreat, and then talk about more about coming in to the Catholic Church in a little while. But I want to start off. I want to go back um, to your experiences growing up, um, about getting into psychology. What was the thing that kind of sparked your interest in studying psychology and studying people?
Yeah, that's it. What's interesting about that is I didn't start off interested in psychology. I actually started off interested in the study of filmmaking. So I went to school and studied film, and then I got a major in media communications with a concentration in filmmaking, and I had a minor in literature and language. So I didn't even have a minor in psychology. I think all that was kind of a good thing because when I went back to get my credits in psychology, I was pretty disappointed to what I found in what you might call mainstream psychology. A lot of what I was being taught in my classes, I felt like I learned more about psychology doing filmmaking and in my literature and humanities classes in some ways than I did in a
Mm-hmm.
lot of psychology. But so that didn't, a lot of my psychology classes really didn't inspire me to study psychology. It kind of turned me off to it.
Weird. Odd.
Yeah, but there was one class though, and it was a class where it was called Theories of Personality, and it introduced me to Freud, Jung, and existential psychology, and that really piqued my interest. I got really interested in Freud and Jung, and and it continued to be something that was informing, how I was understanding what I was doing with filmmaking and my life. Uh, but the real turning point for me in terms of getting back into psychology is that I was dating somebody, and her father was a manager at a halfway house at a rehabilitation center for people with head injury. So, excuse me. So I had the opportunity to work there as an overnight supervisor. So I would come in and make dinner for the people who were in the residential center and would sign
Mm-hmm.
people in and out. Everybody would go to bed, and then I could do homework, and read all night while they were asleep. So it was a pretty good deal. And then when I graduated, there was an opportunity for me to take over as program manager of that facility, and because the person who had hired me was leaving and was going somewhere else, so I accepted that position. And so I was going in every day, working with people who were really struggling with, you know, head traumas that they had that were really had transformed their life. And I found that I really felt it was a blessing to be able to work with people who are going through a very difficult life transition, and that I could be there and offer something to them. Just a caring ear, just an openness to listen to what
Mm-hmm.
they had to say. And I found that that was very meaningful. And so I thought, that might be something I'd like to do for my career instead of filmmaking. And at that point, I'd kind of gotten jaded with filmmaking, partly because I realized the lifestyle wasn't a good one because I wanted to be a father. I wanted to have a family. And I realized
Mm-hmm.
that going into filmmaking would require probably a lot of travel and uh, a lot of unpredictability. It would be
Mm-hmm.
a stressful lifestyle in that regard. So I didn't know what I wanted to do, but the ironically thing was, what really convinced me, tipped me over the edge, was going to a movie. I was kind of depressed one day, and not knowing what I wanted to do with my life. I had been engaged to someone, and that hadn't worked out. I was graduated. I was working at this job, but it wasn't something that I could see myself doing for the rest of my life. And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to go to a movie just to get out of the house.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know what was playing. We didn't have the internet back then. So I got in my car and I just randomly drove to the theater. And when I got to the theater, everything was playing except one movie, which was Groundhog Day, by starring Bill Murray.
Mm-hmm.
And I really didn't want to see a silly comedy, and I know Bill Murray a lot of times was in silly comedies. So I was looking for like a Bergman film, like
Mm-hmm.
something that was kind of dark and dreary and
Uh-huh.
full of angst, and but as it turned out, there was something about Groundhog Day that I found really profoundly moving. It's this character is very self-absorbed. I could identify with that. I think in some ways I
Mm-hmm.
realized I was really always mainly thinking about myself, and that really wasn't making me happy. And that when I was working with people and I felt like I was giving myself to them in some way, that
Mm-hmm.
really felt meaningful, and it felt like I felt happy, and that I was doing something worthwhile. And I saw in the sort of narrative arc of Groundhog Day how this very self-centered person goes through a kind of an ego death, where he commits
Mm-hmm.
suicide, I don't know, many, many times, and lives the same day over and over again. And he can't kill himself. So he decides, well, I might as well live a meaningful life. And he starts experimenting with that. And ultimately, where he ends with is doing, really finding meaning in being there for others, right? Being a
Mm-hmm.
gift to others. And I was very attracted to that. And I walked out of the theater and I said, okay, I'm going to get my doctorate in psychology. And then that kind of set me on my way. So it was really a desire for meaning and coming
Mm-hmm.
to a recognition in my early 20s that a really meaningful life had something to do with self transcending, about being
Mm-hmm.
for others, about self giving. So I had a real sense of that. And the rest is history, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
went to Duquesne
So.
University and et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the you're talking about, the focus of the work that you do is on emotions, and as we've talked about before, a lot is centered around joy. What got you on that track of wanting to especially focus on joy?
Yeah. Well, it was my first client. Well, I don't think it was my first client, but it was one of my first clients. I was
Mm-hmm.
working in the clinic at Duquesne University, and you do what's called an intake. Somebody comes in and you interview them and you find out what's their presenting problem. And so I'm learning how to be a good psychotherapist, and very nervous, not really knowing what I'm doing. And having read quite a bit about things, but knowing things in books and actually doing it are two different things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was maybe the third client I'd ever seen. This young woman. I think she was a senior at the time. And when I asked her what her presenting problem is, she said, "I don't have any joy in my life." So she was presenting her problem as not as depression or anxiety
Mm-hmm.
or any other kind of disorder you could find in DSM-5. It was an absence of a quality of life that she felt was the problem. And she didn't really fit the criteria for depression. She wasn't having suicidal thoughts. She wasn't having insomnia. She wasn't really, thinking morbid thoughts or things like that. She was having some strange
Mm-hmm.
dreams. So I went to my supervisor and I said, well, what do you do with somebody who lacks joy in life? And he says, good question. He says, I don't know. So I said, okay, well, I guess I'll go read about it. So I went to the research literature. PsycInfo is what psychologists tend to look at, or index.
Mm-hmm.
And there was nothing, like almost zero
Mm-hmm.
research on joy. So I thought, well, there you go. There's my dissertation topic. There's very little research. And I was taking a research methods class, and we had an opportunity in that class to do like a pilot study. That was a
Mm-hmm.
qualitative research. So I did the pilot study. In the first time I did the research, it was the data was kind of thin. The way I did the interviews, it didn't yield really good data. Then I started to do a technique where I had people do drawings, abstract drawings using color and form to try to communicate their experience of the emotion. And then that was very generative. That gave me a lot of rich data. And then it would prompt people. It kind of gave people license to use like metaphor and analogy and things like that to describe their experience. And that was really gave me a wealth of data. So I thought, okay, perfect. So I went on and did my dissertation, defended it, and that was a big piece of my dissertation. So that's basically how it got started. Is there was somebody who came in and said, I need to know, how to have more joy. And we didn't really know even what joy was. Like, what is joy?
Mm-hmm.
How do you help somebody to have more joy in their life? And so that's been the beginning of my journey. I guess that would have been
Yeah.
like 1998 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And
So,
yeah.
so what in all that research and all that work you were doing, did you come up with a definition of what joy was?
Yes. I mean, I think the probably the simplest expression of it would be a kind of being fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
But that's I don't think quite captures it. It really involved. I mean, descriptively, it involved. Well, let me back up a minute because I want to
Mm-hmm.
say that there's different ways that you can study joy. One way you can study is by looking at it as a state. Like, so it's a rather fleeting experience. It comes and goes.
Mm-hmm.
And then another way you can look at joy is as a mood, which would be a general sort of background mood that might carry with you throughout the day or maybe a week or for a period of time, but it's still more transitory. And then we can talk about dispositional joy or state or
Mm-hmm.
trait joy, which would be more of a personality disposition, a disposition to have experiences of joy more so than others. And then you could also talk about joy as a spiritual fruit, which is
Mm-hmm.
uh, which is still another way of conceptualizing joy. So when I started off, I was studying state joy, how people experienced these sort of fleeting moments of joy, and then later went on to
Mm-hmm.
study the other dimensions. So when people had this momentary experience of joy, it was really a kind of powerful, energized feeling moving up and out of the body is how people described it. It was this movement up and
Mm-hmm.
out. People would describe it the way I'm doing it with their hands. They talked about, but even though it was a very powerful experience, there was a kind of sense of peace and security in that
Mm-hmm.
power. It didn't feel out of control or dangerous. Uh, and along with that, a feeling of connectedness to the world around them and to other people, whether or not those
Mm-hmm.
people were physically present, a sense of connection to others, and an altered sense of experience in time. So they tended to be focused on a kind of present, but not like you would be stuck in the present, like if you were bored, not knowing what to do. It
Mm-hmm.
was more like a very pregnant kind of present where people used very mystical language. They talked about having a sense of the eternal,
Mm-hmm.
an access to that it felt timeless or beyond time, like
Mm-hmm.
very kind of mystical type of language. And they talked about their experience of space, their perception of space as a sort of opening up. Like it felt like the aperture of their awareness was kind of opening up. And that's interesting because you think about a lot of negative experiences are sort of closing down of perception. When
Mm-hmm.
when we're angry, we tend to focus on the object of our anger and we lose the context. Anxiety is like that too, and fear tends to
Mm-hmm.
focus our attention. Whereas positive emotions in general, but joy in particular, is just really more of an expansive uh,
Mm-hmm.
experience. So literally, they would describe experiences of joy as like opening onto the blue of the sky. Like in
Mm-hmm.
their experience, like that. That was what they remembered in the experience. It was literally this expanding of their perception and of their horizons. And then they felt
Mm-hmm.
nurtured and they felt like they grew in some way from the experience.
Yeah. Well,
So
it sounds like this experience of joy that you're describing is very much transcendent.
yes, right.
Yes, and when you were studying, and you were working on this, you weren't at that moment. You were still an atheist, right?
That's right.
Right. So how did you connect this? What was your what was your idea of what the transcendent was
Right.
at that
Well,
time?
that's the problem is it was really contrary to what I expected to find in many ways. I was coming from a variety of different thinkers, but I was thinking of people like Nietzsche, for example, who
Mm-hmm.
thought that this sense of if you think of the divine as a kind of transcendence or uh, usually people, at least I associated that with sort of the afterlife or with deferring
Mm-hmm.
one's happiness to the future. And so I did expect to have this sense of uh, present, that people would find joy in the moment and they wouldn't be
Mm-hmm.
deferring that to some later time, maybe afterlife or something like that. So, Nietzsche talked about a kind of amor fati, a love of fate, finding the joy in the imminent, right, rather than the transcendent. So
Yeah.
I think I was sort of informed by that, and also I'd be, Heidegger I think does have a sort of a sense of the transcendent, but in many ways, when you read Heidegger and existential philosophy, it's really very much a philosophy of immanence. It's like we're sort of locked within ourselves. Heidegger's being in the world is a very kind of, in some ways it has a sense of the transcendent, but really it's not. It's like the world
Mm-hmm.
is me and I am the world. I was coming from a place that Charles Taylor, has referred to as the buffered self. I wasn't thinking in terms of the transcendent. So when I was
Mm-hmm.
finding that in my data, I found it kind of puzzling. You know, I didn't know how to make sense of that.
Right.
There were
And
places that
so,
I turned to, but yeah, go ahead.
mm-hmm. So, so this idea, or what you were finding, in people seeking this transcendence or seeing joy in something transcendent beyond the right now. Um, what was your idea at that time about what they were looking for, or as you say, if they were looking for something beyond the here and now, and did you have a concept of some sort of a religious idea of transcendence in a negative light?
Yeah, I think that was part of my agnosticism and atheism, is this sort of assumption that, I think, and also there was a kind of, you know, there's something about studying psychology that really they emphasize, individual. There's an individualism that's sort of latent in a lot of it. That ultimately
Mm-hmm.
people are involved in. I think it's very influenced by utilitarianism because it comes out of that British empiricist tradition where we sort of calculate what we want to do, but in a very hedonic kind of way. We calculate
Mm-hmm.
whether something is good for us based on whether it's going to make us feel good or whether it's going to make us feel bad. So there's always this sort of reference to ourselves in all of our decision making. There isn't really a sense of the possibility for an altruism or a being for another in any kind of genuine way. It's all self-centered. I think that's also influenced by Darwinism, which of course I was very steeped in Darwinism.
Mm-hmm.
And evolutionary theory is fascinating and extremely informative. Uh, but it does lack a sense of the transcendent, because the idea of the organism is primarily self-serving, right? And
Mm-hmm.
was so I think all of that was informing a lot of the psychology I was studying, whether it was Freud,
Mm-hmm.
who basically everything's ultimately driven by the pleasure principle. It all comes back
Mm-hmm.
to me and what I want and my desires. And everything else is sort of a rationalization or a defense mechanism denying that.
Mm-hmm.
Or Skinner, B.F. Skinner in behaviorism is, hedonic psychology, that basically all behavior is motivated by what he calls reinforcement, which is really just pleasure and the avoidance of
Mm-hmm.
pain. So everything boils down to that. Um, and on and on. Even, cognitive psychology, even though it brings in higher cognition, it still retains this kind of hedonic psychology. So that was a lot of what I was reading, whether it was more psychoanalytic or more experimental behavioral and cognitive psychology, or
Mm-hmm.
neuroscience, which is very informed by Darwinian evolutionary theory. So I was getting this sense.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking for that sort of in the data, but yet people were really, even though they were describing something that was pleasurable, the experience really wasn't a focus on the pleasure. It was really the self-transcending, this moving towards an
Mm-hmm.
other, a little other, other people, and then
Mm-hmm.
really a kind of big other, something you might call divine. I could, in
Mm-hmm.
in retrospect, especially, I see that in the data.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
So then, as a pivot point, you have an experience of the transcendent. Just tell me a little bit about this experience that you had at this retreat as this kind of a nexus point in your life.
yeah. Well, what led up to it was, as I said, I was going to mass with my wife, and at that point, I was living
Mm-hmm.
in Buffalo, New York. I was working in a place called Damon College, and I was there for 4 years before I came to Pittsburgh. And we had been going to a church that was very close to our apartment, and we didn't really feel a real hospitality at that church, especially for children. We had a very young infant. Well, he was maybe a toddler at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But it was like we would sit down in the church, and everybody would people would move away. We didn't feel welcome. We felt like we were a nuisance. So we decided we maybe should find a mass that was more family friendly. And so my
Mm-hmm.
wife asked around to some folks in her network, and they recommended this church. St. Stephen's is the name of the church, which is
Mm-hmm.
on an island just north of the city of Buffalo called Grand Island. So we started going there, and it took us like a half hour to get there, but we
Mm-hmm.
drove there, and it was a very family friendly mass. It was packed. I mean, there
Mm-hmm.
was tons of people there, and then we would show up, and the usher, one particular usher, but everybody there, all of the ushers were immensely hospitable, and I felt, there was a sense of like it wasn't pretense, like they were really
Mm-hmm.
genuinely happy to see you and welcoming you there.
Uh-huh.
And that was really
That's always a good experience. Yeah.
that was a very good experience, yeah. And then this usher that would stand, he would usually stand behind where we sat in the church. We would kind of sit in the back of the church, and he would always make a point to make some gesture to my son Dean. He would like
Mm-hmm.
give him a nickel, or I mean, like say something to him, or
Uh-huh.
crack it, or say a joke to him. And so I felt like he really appreciated that we had this child with us, and he really made him feel good about coming to mass too, and we felt
Mm-hmm.
good about that as well. So one day that guy, uh, after mass, I was walking out, and he approached me and said, "Hey, we're having this retreat. Would you
Mm-hmm.
like to come?" And my motivation, my first instinct was, "Ooh, a retreat? No, I don't want to do that." But I like this guy. I wanted to be friends
Mm-hmm.
with him, because
Yeah.
I just saw something in him, that I was like, I'd like to be friends with this person. He seems like a virtuous, good person, and someone who I'd like to have in my life as a friend. So,
Mm-hmm.
so I went to the retreat, and it was one of these retreats where you would go once a week, and we would have dinner, and then we would usually watch a video and then have a discussion
Mm-hmm.
based on the video. But at the very end, it was a Saturday. We had a whole day concluding event, and part of that included 3 hours of silence where we were
Mm-hmm.
supposed to pray, and then you had the option of going to confession. They weren't going to
Mm-hmm.
coerce you, but if you wanted to during that
Mm-hmm.
time, you could go to confession. So again, when they told me that, I was like, no way, I'm not going to confession. It was like, forget that. I'll pray in
Uh-huh.
silence. So I did that, and I took, like, they handed us some things, like some prayers, a couple sheets of
Mm-hmm.
paper with some prayers on it, and I got through those in like, a couple minutes probably.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was like, okay, now what am I going to do? So I really did sit there in silence, real in a contemplative attitude in the
Mm-hmm.
cemetery in the back of the church. And I honestly thought this is going to be extraordinarily boring. Uh, I was like, how am I going to tolerate 3 hours of this?
Mm-hmm.
And it was just the opposite. It was anything but boring. I really felt the presence of God breaking through and really communicating to me very distinctly messages, communicating to me
Mm-hmm.
things that God wanted me to hear. And one of the reasons I knew it was God was because, and not just sort of me talking to myself, is that
Mm-hmm.
God was saying things to me that were surprising me, like that I wouldn't
Hmm.
say to myself. Like he was saying, "You're going to go back to Pittsburgh." That was when I was in Buffalo. And
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I'm tenure track. There's no jobs in Pittsburgh. My
Mm-hmm.
wife is never going to do that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
I'm arguing with God, saying, no way, that's not going to happen. You don't do that to yourself. You know what I mean? You don't argue with
Mm-hmm.
yourself like that. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and so it was a real sense of a transcendent voice, and that this was God. And also the fact that I wasn't bored at all. This 3 hours went by, and it went by like so fast. I didn't have a sense of time passing because I was so absorbed, and really a feeling of peace too that came over me that I don't think I'd ever quite experienced before. A feeling of you know just this kind of energy, that came with that presence. Vibrant energy in the atmosphere, that was kept me enraptured. And yeah, so the other thing was go back and study joy. You need to get back to that research on joy. I had drifted away from it. I'd kind of gotten a bit jaded about it because I didn't know how to make sense of this transcendent stuff, probably.
Yeah.
And God was like, you need to go back and do research on that. And the other thing is, God said you should volunteer for hospice. Those were really three clear messages that I got. So I said, okay, I will do that. Of course, I'm now in Pittsburgh, so you know how that turned out.
Yeah. So then, what happened after that to get you back to Pittsburgh?
Literally, the earth had to move for that to happen. I mean, there's so many aspects of that story that it would take me probably several hours to talk about all the amazing things that happened for that to happen, because it seemed like it was impossible.
But there was a lot of providence in those events that brought you back to Pittsburgh.
Right. It was providence. Yeah. There was like, I'll give you a couple things, but one was things were going very well for me at Daemen College. And right after this, it was like things started to go wrong. There was a lot of turmoil in our department that emerged after that, and just a number of things like that started to make me feel like, okay, maybe I really do need to consider what's out there. And then, I had looked in Pittsburgh before because I grew up in Pittsburgh, and there was never any jobs that fit my description. When you apply for jobs in academia, most of the time, they're looking for somebody with a certain specialty, and it's rare that you're going to find a job that's like a perfect fit for you. And I was definitely kind of a niche person that I didn't know would appeal to a lot of different positions. So I was very skeptical. And then it turns out that there were like 4 or 5 different positions in the general Pittsburgh area that all opened up around the same time. And then I think ultimately I got 3 interviews and 3 offers.
Wow.
It never happens. So I took the best offer, which was at Point Park. So that was wild. And then the other big thing, but I think maybe the biggest obstacle was my wife did not want to move to Pittsburgh. She was very connected. She felt very at home in Buffalo. It reminded her of her hometown in St. Louis, Missouri, where we met. And she had made a lot of friends, and Dean had made a lot of friends. Our son, we were happy. We were happy there. So, but there was a event that you might almost seems miraculous. And this, I suppose you could say it was a coincidence, but we came down to Pittsburgh for Christmas because my mother lives here, and she has a house at that time that was vacant, and she usually had rented it out, but it wasn't rented. So we stayed there while we came. And when I had been in graduate school, we had actually lived in that house, which is actually the house that I'm in now because we bought it later from my mom. But so when we came down to the house, we were walking up the stairs to go in the house, and my wife went like that, like she was surprised by something. I thought, oh no, is there some disaster, some natural disaster? Was there a flood or something in the basement? Or my mind is thinking all these bad things, and she's like, "There's a holly bush," and I was like, "What?" So yeah, there's a holly bush, and I was like, "What are you talking about, a holly bush?" And she says, "There's a holly bush." So apparently a holly bush had sprouted right next to the porch. And it turns out that was my wife had said when we lived in Pittsburgh that if we had continued to live here, she always wanted to plant a holly tree in that spot. So that she took that as a sign that we were to come back to Pittsburgh. And
it's almost like that scene in Miracle on 34th Street with the cane.
Yeah. It really was. So you could say, well, I mean, you could say it's a coincidence, I suppose. But, I mean, how often do holly trees just spontaneously grow without planting them?
Right.
I don't know.
Right.
But
and
in the exact
especially
spot,
in a spot, yeah,
where the person wanted them to be planted, it had no significance to me. I'd have been like, oh, there's a holly bush there. It would have had no significance to me. But it was just what she needed to feel like, okay, I can move to Pittsburgh. Well, once she gave me license, then I sent out applications. And then I thought, well, nothing will come of that. I'll send out applications and they're going to find somebody else who's more qualified or a better fit. And then I got 3 offers. In fact, the funny thing is, because I got so many offers all around the same time, I had to do these interviews like back to back. I drove down to Pittsburgh to do an interview, and then I had to drive I drive east, through the mountains of Pennsylvania to a place that's about 45 minutes outside of Pittsburgh. And there was a snowstorm that day, so I had an interview, and I had to drive through the snow to get to the other interview, and I had like 4 hours to get there or something. No, like an hour to get there through the snow. So it was very.
So here you are in Pittsburgh. You have to drive out of Pittsburgh, and there's a snowstorm.
Right.
And the movie that you look back to was Groundhog Day.
That's right.
Where he's leaving Pittsburgh, and there's a snowstorm.
He's trying to get
God
back
is bringing
to Pittsburgh. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
It comes full circle. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
God is using the snowstorm. Yeah. I don't want you to take that other job. I want you to take the one in Pittsburgh. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then my son's birthday was right after that. So I had to drive from that second interview back to Buffalo. And then it was like 3 feet of snow. It was like a huge snowstorm. And that wasn't going to stop me. I wasn't going to miss my son's birthday. So I was literally putting my life in my hands driving up. 79 all the way to Buffalo in 3 feet of snow.
So you get the job in Pittsburgh, and then you start working there, and then you go back to your research on joy, right?
Right.
And so how did that change now that you are in a different place spiritually? How did that change your research in joy, and what came of it after that point?
Well, I think then I understood the transcendent in a very different way. I think here's the interesting thing. I started, when I came down to Point Park, I started teaching a course called Happiness, Well-Being, and Human Strength. So that was a class where I taught, well-being and happiness, drawing upon, available research that was done, as well as my own. But what I began to see in the research, not just in my own research, but in across the board, is that religion and spirituality was very consistently correlated with positive outcomes, mental health, better mental health, and higher levels of happiness, no matter how you define that. So, like, even if you talked about subjective well-being, which is more hedonic, even that they were higher there. So ironically, even though spirituality usually teaches, not looking for immediate gratification and cultivating virtue, self-restraint, that actually people who are spiritual or identify with a particular religion actually experience more pleasure in life, ironically. So it was like they weren't looking for that, but it was like a byproduct of living a virtuous life. So I saw that.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting. And it's funny because I would teach it, and because I teach the science. I was literally following what the science says, reporting it. And it's funny because you get reactions from people. A lot of the students, would comment at the end of the semester. They were surprised. They didn't like that part of the course, that I said religion was good for you, And I would just say, well, I'm just I'm just reporting what the evidence says.
Yeah.
And but there is the religion in some cases can be negative, and in particular when people have an understanding of God as a non-loving, sort of punishing type of God, a God without mercy, you might say, is not a good God to have in your belief system if you want to be happy and virtuous. But I also started to shift in how I understood happiness in general, what the good life means. And that came from studying people like my friend Paul Wong, a Canadian psychologist. He identifies 4 different ways of understanding the good life. So there's the hedonic approach, which is looking for pleasure, associated with things like materialism and consumerism. There's what he calls prudential happiness, which is really about being engaged. but there's not a moral or ethical component to that. You could be a very engaged sociopath, and that would be, prudential happiness. Engagement alone doesn't get at the moral or ethical dimension. Where you start to get into the moral and ethical is within the eudaimonic approach to happiness, which is where happiness is defined in terms of a life of excellence, living a life of virtue. And then Paul adds a fourth dimension, which is really important to understanding my research, I think. He calls it the chironic dimension, which is about joy or happiness more as a spiritual fruit, something that comes out of the spiritual life, a feeling of awe, openness to the mystery of the transcendent, but also gratitude, a feeling of fortunateness about one's situation. So what I began to realize is, looking back on my research on joy and some of the new research I was doing on trait joy or dispositional joy, is it had all of that. It brought all of those aspects of happiness together. It was people who were higher in the virtues tended to experience more joy.
Yeah.
And when they had experience of joy, it had this chironic quality. It was
Yeah.
all about feeling
Well,
fortunate,
yeah.
a sense of awe, an openness to the
Yeah.
mystery, all those things. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that is a good teaser for our next episode.
Good.
Our next episode, we're going to be diving more into your research on joy and really getting in depth into it. I think it's such an interesting area of research in psychology because, as you said, it does bridge between the physical side of our psychology to our transcendent spiritual side. But to wrap up this conversation, I have a very important question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Besides psychology, what are some things you nerd out over? What are some that you really get into studying?
I'm very interdisciplinary. I mean, I love to study geek out on lots of different stuff. Physics, history, literature, biology, but I would say lately, my latest thing that I have been fascinated by is Maxwell's demon.
Mm.
It's a theory, or actually a thought experiment, a Gedanken in physics. It goes back to 1867. One of the things I find is kind of interesting about it, because this is really the beginning of a period of time when, say, in psychiatry in the hospitals, you have a very anti-clerical movement where they're disparaging the church and trying to rid psychiatry of any notion of the supernatural, and you tend toward this very biologically reductive understanding of psychological problems. That ultimately leads to eugenics. Those ideas in the late 19th century, and but this sort of brain-based medical model psychiatry really begins to emerge at that time. And part of the rhetoric around that is that they're dispelling these old superstitious ideas like angels and demons and things like that, and exorcisms. And then at the very year that Magnin, who's the major materialist, publishes his first work in physics, this guy comes up with a thought experiment that involves a demon, and the most hardest of sciences in physics. And the idea is that it's a thought experiment to try to think through the problem of entropy in thermodynamics. So he says that imagine when you have a thermodynamic system, that it's very almost so unlikely that it's nearly impossible that the molecules would all drift to one side, say, of a cube. They tend to distribute themselves within the cube in a sort of more chaotic or random or unpredictable ways as entropy increases. So he imagines if you had a door between the two parts of a cube, and there was a demon who could open the door whenever a heat molecule was coming through and open it up, you could transform a system that's in entropy back into an ordered system that can generate heat. And that's called Maxwell's demon. And it turns out that problem's never been solved, and it's still something that people are talking about. And in fact, it's now people are very interested in it because we've sort of changed our understanding of what entropy is. That people are starting to think about entropy as really about information, about the predictability of a system. entropy is really about inability to make predictions, and so it has to do with information.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, long story short, there's now an interest in Maxwell's demon because we can use that concept to sort of slow down the process of entropy by creating, technology that acts like Maxwell's demon in
Mm-hmm.
order to make smaller and smaller information processing devices that generate less heat. So
Uh-huh.
there's actually a technological application for it. And isn't it ironic that the demon is
Yeah.
also associated with heat and generating
Yes.
heat? So I get a
Yeah.
kick out of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Brent, thank you so much for joining me today, and be sure to come back next week, everyone. We're going to be talking with Brent more about his research into joy, and looking at how that bridges this world of the mental and the psychological with the spiritual and transcendent. And I'm looking forward to that conversation. I think it's going to be really interesting. I'm looking forward to talking more with Brent next week, and I'm looking forward to seeing you as well next week. So join us again next week. Thanks. God bless.
System shut down.